Hi everyone, Falling Up 90 here, and today I'll be showing one of the most bizarre locomotives in all of HO scale. I say bizarre because what you see in front of you is a Western Maryland 2662, number 955. Now that's all fine and dandy and all, but it's way beyond that. Not only because of what this locomotive is based off of, but what the current situation for a Western Maryland 2662 we have today. It's just funny, ironic, and of all things, it's almost as if Mantua predicted the future with this model. Alright, let me state the obvious. This is not an actual Western Maryland 2662. They did have a 2662, and it did have a number, 955, but it didn't look anything like this. The model that Mantua based this off of is actually from a narrow gauge tank engine. So that was the Uintah Railway number 50. It did not have a tender looking like this. So that locomotive was built by Baldwin in 1926. It eventually went to the Sumter Valley Railway in 1940, and by 47 was sent to a railway in Guatemala. Quite a bit of history for that locomotive. Now, unfortunately, that locomotive is not with us today because that had been scrapped sometime in the 60s or 70s. But that's a locomotive that Mantua chose to base their 2662 off of. They do have a version that is a tank engine, so it's a lot more realistic than this one. But again, it's brought up to a standard gauge size. It's kind of funny that of all the 2662s, they chose the narrow gauge one. Now, for the Western Maryland one, that one was also built by Baldwin, but that was built about 20 years before the Uintah Railway one was. It didn't look anything like this. As far as I know, I looked at some pictures of it, and I really couldn't find anything past around the first time it was in operation, because there's not really many modern pictures of it, modern being like post-1920. The locomotive was used up to the late 40s, early 50s, and that's pretty much all I've known about that. So, a lot of inaccuracies so far in this model. But it gets even more interesting than that. In the world of model rating, there were more than plenty locomotives that never actually existed. Whether it's in the wrong paint scheme, the wrong style, or just a truly exotic locomotive that didn't even come close. This one's kind of an example of that. Now, the Western Maryland is sort of the exception to the rule. As far as I know, that's the only one I can think of. Because for those of you who not only follow the Western Maryland, there's also the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad. That's a tourist railroad that runs between Cumberland and Frostburg, Maryland. They have a couple locomotives which are painted up in the Western Maryland, but aren't actually Western Maryland locomotives. The ones I do know at least is they have a Jeep 30, which is painted up in the Western Maryland, but that is a former Pennsylvania Railroad Jeep 30. The infamous 280 they have there, number 734, that one's actually a former Lake Superior and Ishpeming number 34, and the tender that goes with that locomotive is a former Mohawk tender from the New York Central system. That's an interesting little locomotive in its own. And now they have a 2662. I knew that they bought this locomotive from the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad Museum, and that is a Chesapeake, Ohio 2662, number 1309. But I was pretty surprised when I first noticed that they actually painted the tender and will be painting a locomotive like this for the Western Maryland. So now we have a Western Maryland 2662 today that isn't actually a Western Maryland 2662. It's kind of like the locomotive that the camera is pointing at right now. That's kind of interesting in its own regard. Unlike the 280 that the Western Maryland Scenic Railway has, they're going to keep the 2662's number, 1309, which is for the C&O. If they were to give it a Western Maryland 2662 number, it might be 955, but they're just going to keep it 1309. That locomotive, as a 2662, is also built by Baldwin, but was built much, much later than the other 2662s that we've talked about. This one was built by Baldwin in 1949 and as far as I know, was only in operation for 5 years. Now, 5 years is not a very long time for a steam locomotive to be in operation. Unfortunately, though, I don't think it was handled or treated as well as the other 2662s, especially the original Western Maryland 955. By the late 40s, even new steam locomotives that were coming out weren't really maintained or treated as well as steam locomotives in the prime of the steam era. The Western Maryland 2662 was built 40 some years prior. It was pretty much finishing up its career by the time the 1309 was built. So the 1309, with the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, was not really maintained that well. A lot of locomotives that the Chesapeake and Ohio had were pretty roughly maintained, and there was a lot of times that they had a locomotive that was just a year or two old, and they would soon start selling it off to other railways. When the other railways received them, they were already roughed up in such a short amount of time. So 5 years may not seem like a long time for a steamer, but they aged pretty fast on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. Now, I'm not really going to completely bash the C&O. A lot of railroads were like this. Very few really truly cared for their steamers by the late 40s, early 50s. At that time, it was a railroad crew would have a steam locomotive, and they wouldn't really care for it too much, because if this locomotive were to break down, they would get to have a brand new, cleaner, much easier to run diesel locomotive. So steamers by the late 40s, early 50s were already disregarded by crew. And even though they might be brand new locomotives, they just weren't treated as nicely as locomotives from the 20s or even the 30s. This is unfortunately the truth about steam operations towards the end of the steam era. There were a couple reasons that the Western Maryland Scenic chose number 1309. I can't remember all of them entirely, but one thing is, by the size of the locomotive, that was pretty much the largest locomotive they could operate on the line, and that's going by the size of their turntable. I haven't paid too much attention to that restoration project. There were a couple unfortunate incidents that sort of halted the project for a bit, but they are back on it. Hopefully that gets completed sometime in the next 2 to 3 years. I'm not entirely sure of what the condition of the 1309 was like when it first arrived at the Western Maryland shops. There must have been a certain reason why they elected to pick this locomotive, and it just might be because of size. I'm not sure if they felt like the locomotive was in fantastic shape or not, but right now it's probably in a lot better of shape than it has been in the last 60 years. So I really hope that this locomotive does come back into operation, and we can definitely see a fake 2662 from the Western Maryland like the one we have right here. To sum everything up so far, there's a fake Western Maryland 2662 in front of us, but there's also a fake Western Maryland 2662 in real life. And you know what? Who really cares about prototypical accuracy? I like this model. I know it's not realistic. It's not even the right scale. But I just like the way it looks. And I'm definitely into that Western Maryland Fireball scheme. There are other models in HO scale that have the Western Maryland Fireball scheme, but I want it on a more unique locomotive like this. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the thing about model rareting is you get stuff which interests you, even if it isn't a locomotive that actually existed in real life. In this case, the Western Maryland 2662 doesn't look anything like this. But I'm okay with that. I just like this locomotive. It's just this weird, unique locomotive that predicted the future. Mantua predicted that there would be a fake Western Maryland 2662 in real life. Okay, not really, but it's just funny in that ironic way. One more thing about this model in particular is this isn't a truly original Mantua model. Mantua did have 2662s that first came out, I believe, in the early 80s, both in the tank and tender versions. When Mantua ceased production in 2001, a few years later, Model Power brought back some of the Mantua models and put them in the Mantua Classics line. So they brought back the 2662 that you see in front of you. And one of the schemes they put out was the Western Maryland scheme that we have here. The Western Maryland scheme was not an option when Mantua originally put this model out under their own line. Another difference I've noticed is that at least on this model compared to some of the older ones, as they put the air pumps in front of the smoke box, which is not present on the previous models. I do have another Mantua 2662, which is actually an original Mantua model, not a Model Power Mantua Classics version that we have here. So there are some differences between the two cosmetically, but there's also a little bit difference in sort of like the wiring. Now I'm not going to bring out my other Mantua 2662, and that's mostly because it's really deep in storage. I'm not exactly sure where it is in storage, and it would take well over an hour to locate it, bring it out, and put it on display for this little video. But one thing I can tell you is there's difference in wiring, like I said. In the original Mantua 2662 model, there's just two single wires that run between the engine and tender. Well, this has a plug, so this is a DCC ready model. Now I kind of like this wiring harness because it is a plug, it is secure, there's no wires hanging or anything like that. You just snap them together and the locomotive and tender are secure. I really like that. So that's a nice improvement that they had over the older model. Now one thing I'm kind of disappointed with, and this might also apply to the original one, is that they didn't actually have any cover for the cab. A couple weeks ago, I reviewed my Mantua 442, and that was a model from 1986. Mantua doesn't really have too many models where there is detail in the cab, and the 442 was no exception. But they had like this nice cover to it, and it was the same color as the locomotive itself. So it hid the motor pretty well. But here it's pretty much exposed. There's no backhead detail, there's a motor sticking out, and there's no covering to it. So it kind of does stick out a bit. Not too bad though, but other than that, this is it's a nice model overall. So like I stated earlier, the model is based off of a narrow gauge locomotive. And when you try to scale up narrow gauge to standard gauge, you're going to get things that are out of proportion. So here we're going to compare this to a locomotive which was actually in standard gauge and is much more prototypical in size to its real-life counterpart than this would ever be. The Big Boy from River Rossi. And because of its extra size proportions, it's almost as tall as the Big Boy, when in reality it will be a lot smaller than this. Now, if you can get, look away from being oversized and you don't really care about that, you can really appreciate just how nice of a model this is. In fact, I think this is one of the cheapest articulated locomotives in all of HO scale. Articulateds aren't really cheap in general, but this is a good one to sort of start out with. Now, the River Rossi Big Boy, for example, it's a pretty nice model, and like I said, it's accurate in scale and everything. But even a used one of these will cost more than a new in box Mantua 2662. And that's kind of the way things are in HO scale. You pay more for a more accurate locomotive. But really, if you can get away with having a locomotive that's not in scale and not really care about that, you can really appreciate just how nice of a model this is. Pricing is kind of funny for this model. As I said earlier, the Mantua 2662 is generally one of the cheapest articulateds you can get in HO scale. And that's mostly because you don't care about accuracy at that point. And it is a nice 2662 in general, but sometimes there's a difference in pricing. In the general HO scale market, some paint schemes fetch a higher price than others, even on the same model. The Western Maryland version I've seen generally on some of the lower pricing ones. Recently there was a Sierra Railway 2662 that sold for over $350. I'm not entirely sure why it's worth that much according to buyers, but maybe my guess is that particular paint scheme is more rare than other ones. So in general, you're going to see some of these being higher priced. I wouldn't recommend going after those because overall They're the same locomotive, they just have a different paint scheme. And I guess if you're looking for a rare, really collectible model, maybe go after that if you have the money. But if you're just looking for a Mantua 2662, there'll be some out there that will sell even for less than $80. They're out there. I mean, they're always going to be coming in flow on eBay, and they come in a variety of styles and paint schemes. But in general, you don't have to pay too much for one of these. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the story behind this model. I'm not really going to give a full in-depth review of this model. I don't really think that's necessary, especially because this is not an authentic model by any means, whether it's a Mantua 2662 or just a standard gauge HO scale model. So I'm not really going to go all about the detail about this thing and talk about the truck detail or the eccentric crank or anything like that. I just want you all to appreciate this interesting model and the weird story behind it, and how ironic it is that we now have a fake Western Maryland 2662 in real life. So now I'm just going to run it around the track and give it a realistic constants that it probably had back in the day, and we'll wrap it up from there. So that about wraps up this video. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.